For 7 mornings, the stray cat came to Nora Bellamy's wash shed, carrying pieces of the dead. Not bones, not flesh. Nothing anyone in Bracken Hollow wanted named. Only small things the town had trained itself not to see. A strip of black funeral cloth, a curl of coffin lining, a woman's pearl button, and a thread of pale blue silk knotted so neatly that Nora stopped breathing when she saw it. Mabel, the one-eyed cat, dropped each piece beside the same rusted laundry pail and waited. Most people chased Mabel with brooms. Children called her Grave Cat. Amos Creed, the Undertaker, said animals that slept near coffins picked up sad habits. Deputy Owen Pike told Nora not to trouble herself over scraps. A woman with 14 days left to pay $27 on her wash shed had better things to fear than a strays collection. But Nora had spent 20 years reading stains other people wanted gone. Blood, lamp oil, river mud, fever, sweat, cheap perfume, grief. Cloth told the truth when mouths would not, and that pale blue thread told her one terrible thing. 12 years earlier, Ada Marin had worn that exact stitch in the burial dress Nora pressed with her own hands. Ada had owned 26 acres by Willow Run before fever took her, and before the papers passed through the county office too clean, too fast, and too quietly. When Mabel turned and limped toward the narrow graveyard behind Creed's coffin shop, Nora followed with a lantern in one hand and the pearl button in the other. Mabel stopped at Ada Marin's marker. Then she began to dig. Nora Bellamy did not dig deep that first evening. A woman who owned nothing but a wash shed, 2 iron tubs, 3 cracked buckets, and a narrow strip of yard did not go opening graves behind a respectable man's business after sunset. Not if she wanted work in the morning. Not if she wanted the deputy to keep his hands away from her door latch. Not if she had 14 days before Silas Vane could put her tubs on an auction wagon and call it lawful. So Nora stopped Mabel with both hands, though the cat hissed and twisted as if the soil itself had hold of her. "Enough," Nora whispered. Mabel's one good eye flashed in the lantern light. Her claws had scratched a shallow furrow below Ada Marin's marker, where buffalo grass grew thin and the dirt lay looser than it should. A smell came up from that place. Damp wood. Old cloth. Something sour under it, faint enough that any other woman might have blamed the weeds. Nora had washed burial linen before. She knew the smell of closed places. The back wall of Creed's coffin and undertaking stood 20 paces away, square and black against the last copper streak of evening. One upstairs window glowed. Behind the glass, a shape moved once and went still. Nora gathered the pearl button into her fist, lifted Mabel against her apron, and carried the cat home while the old creature fought her all the way. By morning, Bracken Hollow had made a smaller story out of what it had not understood. At Liddy Cross's boarding house, men said Nora had been caught kneeling at a grave like a mourner with no right to mourn. At the feed store, someone claimed she had tried to steal mourning ornaments. By noon, 3 women had brought shirts to the wash shed and left with them still dirty after seeing Mabel asleep on a flour sack near the stove. "She brings graveyard filth into your place," Mrs. Talbot said, holding a basket against her hip like it was a shield. "My boys don't need that on their collars." Nora kept her hands in the rinse water until the cold steadied them. "Your boys get worse on their collars than a cat ever carried." Mrs. Talbot's mouth tightened. The shirts went back into the basket. That was how punishment worked in Bracken Hollow. Men used papers. Women used silence. Both could empty a table. The wash shed had once been a smokehouse behind a failed livery. Nora's husband, Thomas, had traded 6 months of repair work for the right to move it board by board to the edge of town. He had raised the roof on the north side so rain would run away from the tubs. He had cut a square window above the sorting bench because Nora said white linen told lies in shadow. Thomas had been dead 3 winters now, buried in the public row under a marker Nora could not yet afford to replace. Fever had not taken him. A wagon wheel had, on a wet road south of Willow Run. The driver had paid for the coffin and vanished west before Nora learned his name was false. Since then, the shed had become her whole kingdom. Steam in winter, flies in summer, lye burns on the backs of her hands, pennies stacked in a blue cup under the floorboard. The town brought her what it wanted, made clean, and paid her just enough to stay poor. 4 days earlier, Silas Vane had delivered the notice himself. He had not stepped inside. Clerks did not like damp floors. $27 by the first Monday, he had said. Past balance on the yard lease, water access, and municipal use fee. Municipal use fee for rainwater? Nora asked. For drainage into town ditch. The ditch was there before I was. Silas looked over his spectacles. Records do not consider sentiment, Mrs. Bellamy. Now the notice hung from a nail by the stove, curling at the corners each time the fire breathed. $27 might as well have been $200 if customers began carrying laundry away because of a cat. Mabel did not care. She woke near sundown, stretched her narrow back, and limped to the door. Her torn ear had crusted with dried mud. Burrs clung to her tail. When Nora barred the door with her boot, Mabel sat down and stared. "No," Nora said. The cat stared harder. Nora returned to the sorting bench, where Deputy Owen Pike's shirt lay turned inside out. Owen was young enough to still blush when he brought in laundry, and proud enough to pretend he did not. His cuffs were always stained with ink from copying arrest notices. That day, one cuff held a smear Nora had not seen before. Black paste, gritty between her fingers, with a thin blue thread stuck inside the seam. She froze. It was not the thread from Ada's button. This one was coarser, darker, twisted with a sliver of gray lint that looked like coffin padding. Owen had been behind Creed's shop that morning. He had gone there after Amos complained that a washerwoman had been disturbing old graves. Nora rubbed the thread between thumb and forefinger. A sensible woman would burn it. A woman with rent due would put the shirt in the rinse and keep quiet. Mabel scratched once at the door. Outside, evening wind dragged dust along the lane. The coffin shop bell gave a soft iron clink, though no customer had entered. Nora looked at the notice on the nail, at the half-empty washtub, at the cat waiting with her cloudy eye fixed on the road. Then she wrapped the thread and pearl button in a scrap of flour cloth, took Thomas's old hand spade from behind the stove, and opened the door. Mabel slipped out first. This time, Nora did not carry her back. She followed the cat through the thinning light to Ada Marin's sunken marker. Mabel dropped to the same patch of loose soil and clawed with a desperate, rasping sound. Nora knelt beside her. 3 inches down, the spade struck something soft instead of stone or root. Nora cleared the dirt with her fingers and drew out a narrow strip of black silk, damp at one edge, stitched in pale blue. In one corner, faded but still readable, were 2 embroidered initials. A. Nora did not move when she first saw the initials. The strip of silk lay across her palm like a narrow piece of night, wet along one edge, the blue stitching darkened by soil. A. M. The letters had been made by someone who took pride in small things. Ada Marin had stitched her initials that way on cuffs, handkerchiefs, dress linings, anything that might outlast a season of hard use. Nora remembered teasing her once that a woman could mark a rag and make it look like church linen. Ada had laughed and said, "A thing ought to know who it belongs to." Now that same careful hand had come up from the dirt under a grave that should have been sealed 12 years ago. Mabel clawed again, then slowed. The old cat's ribs moved sharply under her patchy coat, and when she paused, Nora saw one claw split at the tip, bright with a bead of blood. "Stop it," Nora murmured, catching her gently by the scruff. "You'll tear yourself open." Mabel twisted, but the walk from the wash shed had cost her. Cold had stiffened her right front leg, and the torn ear that always gave her a wicked look hung flat with damp. She stared at Nora, then at the loosened soil. As if the two of them had made a bargain Nora was already breaking. The graveyard behind Creed's shop was hardly a proper cemetery. It was a fenced strip between the Undertaker's back wall and a stand of mesquite, used during fever years when the churchyard filled too quickly. The old markers leaned in rows that had lost their order. Ada Marin's marker stood near the far corner, a whitewashed plank weathered down to gray. Nora slid the silk into her apron pocket and touched the soil. It did not feel like old grave dirt. Old grave dirt settled hard. This dirt broke apart in cool crumbs, as if it had been opened, filled, and tamped by someone who wanted it to look older than it was. Behind her, a board creaked. Amos Creed stood at the gate with a lantern held low. He wore his black coat, though the evening was warm, and his white collar looked almost blue in the glow. His face showed no anger. Angry men wasted threats. Calm men saved them. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "you have a habit of finding sorrow after business hours." Nora rose with dirt on both hands. Mabel backed under the marker, tail low. "I found cloth," Nora said, "in a graveyard. That is not a miracle. From a burial dress." Amos's eyes moved to her apron pocket and away again so smoothly another person might have missed it. "You wash for half this town. I imagine you see pieces of everyone everywhere." The shop door opened behind him, and a heavy brindle hound pushed its nose through the gap. Mabel flattened. The hound gave one deep bark that rolled along the fence boards, and Mabel bolted toward Nora's skirt. Amos turned his head only slightly. "Quiet, Samson." The dog stopped, but his lips stayed lifted. Deputy Owen Pike came around the side of the shop a moment later, pulling on his hat as if he had dressed in a hurry. A smear of black paste still marked one cuff. Nora saw it and felt the thread in her apron like a hot coal. "Mrs. Bellamy," Owen said, softer than Amos had. "You can't be back here digging. There are laws about graves. There are laws about stealing from the dead, too." Amos gave a patient sigh. "No one has stolen anything. Old burials shift. Animals drag scraps. Fear makes patterns. You are tired, and I do not say that unkindly." Nora wanted to show the silk, but the strip was not enough. Amos would call it old trimming. Owen would call it a troubling scrap. Silas Vane would ask how Nora came by it, and by morning, the story would be about a washerwoman caught with burial cloth in her pocket. So Nora wiped her hands on her apron and said nothing. Owen walked her to the lane. Not roughly. That almost made it worse. Behind them, Amos waited by the gate until Nora had crossed into public dust, where the last few shopkeepers could see she was being removed without being arrested. "You need to leave this alone," Owen said once they were out of Amos's hearing. Nora looked at his stained cuff. "Were you digging there this morning?" He frowned. "Me? Your sleeve says you were." Color rose in his face. "I helped Mr. Creed set a repair post by the fence. A burial board rotted loose. That is all." Behind Ada Marin's marker, he hesitated too long. A wagon rattled past before he answered. "Near it." Nora nodded, because the silence had told her more than the word. "Do you remember, Ada?" "I was 14. Old enough to remember whether folks viewed her body." Owen's jaw worked. "It was fever summer. People were afraid. Dr. Wren signed. Mr. Creed handled the coffin. Silas recorded the transfer. That is more than most got that year. The transfer. Not the burial, not the mourning, the transfer." Nora carried those words home the way she carried wet sheets, heavy and close to her chest. She did not return at once. She set a pan of milk near the stove for Mabel, wrapped the bloody claw with a torn strip of muslin, and barred the door with Thomas's hand spade laid across the latch. For 3 hours, she listened to the town settle. Hooves faded. Lamps went dark. Somewhere near the coffin shop, Samson barked twice and stopped. Mabel did not drink the milk. She sat facing the door. Near midnight, rain began. A thin needling rain that ticked on the roof and turned dust to black paste. Nora remembered the soil by Ada's grave, loose enough to wash away, and understood what Mabel had been waiting for. Rain would show the seams men tried to hide. She took the lantern, the spade, and a length of laundry cord. This time, she also took Owen's shirt, still unwashed, folded under her arm. Mabel limped ahead through alleys, shining with mud. Twice, Nora had to slow for her. Once the cat stopped beneath a rain barrel, trembling so hard Nora nearly turned back. Then Mabel pushed on. At Ada's marker, rainwater ran into the shallow claw marks and disappeared along a line too straight for roots. Nora tied one end of the laundry cord around the marker and stretched it across the grave by habit, measuring the way she measured sheets before cutting. The sunken patch was short, too short for a grown woman's coffin, unless the coffin had been set crooked or the grave had never been dug to receive one. Nora worked from the side, cutting a narrow trench where the water vanished. Mud sucked at her fingers. The spade struck wood less than 2 feet down. She stopped breathing for a moment, then scraped until a coffin plank showed through. Black with age, but not deep, not where it should have been. Along one edge, the board had rotted soft. Mabel pressed close, sniffed once, and gave a low sound. Nora had never heard from her before. It was not a hiss. It was almost grief. Nora slid the spade under the broken lip and lifted. The plank split with a wet crack. Inside, the lantern light touched no hair, no bone, no folded hands, no remains of a woman buried in her best black dress. There were stones wrapped in sacking, 2 lengths of mildewed coffin lining, and a collapsed pillow stuffed with gray rags. Tucked against one corner lay a wooden dress button, blackened by damp, with pale blue threads still caught through its holes. Nora sat back in the mud, rain running down her neck, while Mabel climbed onto the coffin edge and stood there shaking. Ada Marin's grave had a coffin, but Ada Marin was not inside it. Nora covered the coffin before dawn. She worked with mud under her nails, rain in her hair, and Mabel tucked inside her shawl because the cat had begun to shiver hard enough that Nora felt every bone through the thin coat. She wanted to drag Deputy Owen Pike to the grave and make him look into that false box. She wanted to knock on Amos Creed's back door and ask how a woman could be buried with stones where her body ought to be. But the graveyard still sat behind a respectable man's shop, and the law still listened first to men with keys. So Nora pressed the broken plank back into place, packed mud along the seam, and took only what she dared: the blackened wooden button, a pinch of gray coffin stuffing wrapped in flour cloth, and the terrible knowledge that Ada Marin's grave had been filled with weight instead of a body. By sunrise, Bracken Hollow had given her discovery a different name: grave robbing. The word reached the wash shed before breakfast. Mrs. Talbot's oldest boy stopped by the fence, not with laundry, only with a grin too large for his face. "My ma says you'll hang if you steal from coffins." Nora wrung a towel until her wrists hurt. "Your ma has always had a generous mouth." He ran off laughing, and the laughter traveled faster than truth. At the pump, 2 women turned their shoulders. Outside the feed store, men went quiet when she passed. People who had once handed her fever sheets, birthing sheets, and deathbed pillowcases now looked at her as if death itself had climbed from her tubs. At 9 o'clock, Deputy Owen Pike came to the shed. He removed his hat at the threshold, which gave Nora one small hope until she saw Amos Creed waiting in the lane behind him, close enough to witness, far enough to seem innocent. Owen held a folded paper. "Mrs. Bellamy, I need to ask where you were after midnight." "In bed." Folks saw lantern light behind the coffin shop. Folks see many things once someone tells them where to look. He looked toward Mabel under the sorting bench. The cat's injured paw was wrapped in a strip of muslin, and one cloudy eye watched him without blinking. "Mr. Creed says Ada Marin's grave was disturbed." "Did he say what was inside it?" Owen's face changed only a little. "He said old burials settle. Animals pull scraps loose. People get frightened and imagine patterns." "That sounds like Mr. Creed." Behind him, Amos gave Nora a sorrowful nod. His black coat was brushed clean, his collar bright, his hands folded as if he had come to comfort her instead of accuse her. "There are proper channels for troubled grief, Mrs. Bellamy," he said gently. "Which channel does a washerwoman use?" No one answered. Owen unfolded the paper. "Silas Vane says county records show Ada Marin's burial was witnessed, signed, sealed, and entered on September 9th, 12 years ago. If you continue disturbing burial property, damages may be added to your debt." Burial property. Nora held the phrase still in her mind. A grave could be sacred. A body could be evidence. But property was the kind of word men used when they meant control. After they left, Nora took Thomas's old coat from the peg and wrapped the wooden button into the hem of her skirt. She told Mabel to stay, but the cat only stared from under the bench, tail tight around her wounded paw. Nora knew that look by now. It was not obedience. The Bracken County Courthouse smelled of dust, ink, and wool coats damp from other people's business. Silas Vane sat behind the records counter beneath a framed notice that read, "Order preserve civility." He did not appear surprised to see her. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, closing the ledger before him. "I was told grief had made you restless." "County audit comes next week," Silas added, one hand resting too firmly on the lower drawer. "Old fever papers are trouble enough without a washerwoman teaching cats to read maps. I came to see Ada Marin's probate file. Probate records may be inspected by heirs, attorneys, creditors, and officers of the court. She owed me 6 cents for pressing her burial dress. A creative debt does not make you a creditor of record. Then show me the burial entry. Public death records are public, unless the county has started burying those too." A clerk at the rear desk coughed into his sleeve. Silas heard it. Pride made men do useful things when kindness would not. He rose, took a narrow volume from the shelf, and opened it with dry, careful fingers. Ada Marin, female, fever, certified by Dr. Elias Wren, interred by Amos Creed. No surviving spouse. Property released to Marin Estate Administrator pending probate adjustment. The lines were too clean. During fever summer, names had been written crooked on pine boards because half the town was coughing and the other half was digging. This entry looked as if no one had sweated, feared, or hurried at all. "Who witnessed the body?" Nora asked. "Dr. Wren's certified death." "That is not the same thing. The law does not bend because your imagination has acquired a cat." At the word cat, something moved beneath the bench near the door. Mabel stepped into the room, wet from the street, one paw lifted. Nora stared at her. "You stubborn little sinner." The back clerk stood too quickly and knocked over an ink bottle. Mabel darted from the splash, slipped under the counter, and vanished behind a stack of old map rolls near the lower drawers. Silas barked, "Remove that animal." Nora rounded the counter. Mabel had pressed her nose to a drawer marked Cemetery Plats, Fever Years. When Nora reached for her, the cat hooked one claw into the drawer pull and dragged it open an inch. Silas slammed it shut with his knee. The room went still. Nora straightened. "Why shut a cemetery map? It is not shut. Then open it." Silas looked toward the front window, where 2 townsmen had paused outside. His official smile returned. "Proper requests require filing." That afternoon, Nora found Martha Boone in the old public cemetery, cutting weeds around pauper markers with a knife better suited for skinning rabbits. Martha had kept graves longer than most men kept promises. She was small, hard, and brown as walnut bark. "I don't talk about fever plots," Martha said, before Nora finished Ada's name. "Then listen." Martha kept cutting while Nora told her about the short grave, the loose soil, the stones in the coffin, and the drawer Silas would not open. She did not mention the button in her skirt. Martha's hand slowed only once. At the word, stones. "Grave robbers leave holes," Martha said. "Men hiding mistakes leave things level. You knew." "I knew maps changed." Martha looked toward the courthouse roof above the cottonwoods. "I knew Ada's marker was moved 6 feet east before the paint dried. Amos said the first place was too low and would flood." Silas copied the new row clean. Knowing a thing and proving it are different burdens. "Who asked for the move?" For a moment, Martha seemed to fold inward. Then she reached inside her coat and pressed a stained paper into Nora's hand. It was an older cemetery map drawn in pencil, with rough distances from the fence and fever graves marked by name. Ada Marin's original plot was not where her marker stood now. It was beside another name Nora had not heard in years. Clara Whitcomb. Widow. Fever. Burial. Same week. Same Undertaker. In the margin beside both women's names, Martha had written one word in a cramped, angry hand. Empty. Nora did not sleep with Martha Boone's map in the room. She tried. She set it beneath the flour tin, barred the wash shed door, and told herself that paper could not breathe. But each time the wind moved under the eaves, she thought of the word Martha had written beside 2 women's names. Empty. One empty grave might be a lie. 2 empty graves meant someone had practiced. Mabel slept badly near the stove. Her injured paw twitched through the night, and once she woke with a small, broken sound that made Nora put aside the map and sit beside her until the old cat settled. By morning, Mabel's cloudy eye had filmed with exhaustion. Nora warmed milk in a dented pan and mixed it with a scrap of bacon grease. The cat drank half, then dragged herself to the door and sat there facing town. "You are not going anywhere," Nora said. Mabel blinked once, unimpressed. Nora pinned the old map inside Thomas's coat and went to ask after Clara Whitcomb. Clara had been a widow with 2 small sons and a dry goods account no larger than $7. Nora remembered her as a quiet woman who wore brown dresses and mended cuffs with thread that never matched. Fever summer had taken her, people said, along with both boys. That was how Bracken Hollow survived its own memory. By saying fever took what men did not want explained. At the mercantile, Mr. Hobb kept account books stacked under the counter in the same careful piles he used for sugar, coffee, nails, and gossip. Nora waited until no customers remained before she asked whether he still had Clara's old ledger page. Hobb looked toward the window. "Why would you need a dead woman's account? She owed me for wash. Seems every dead woman owed you for wash lately." Nora held his gaze. Hobb had known her 20 years. He had also known Silas Vane longer. The scale inside him tipped both ways before he sighed and pulled a red-bound book from the lower shelf. "Clara Whitcomb," he muttered, turning pages. "Fever burial. Account settled by estate administrator, October 2nd. Who signed?" He angled the book away. "That is not my trouble. Then let me make it mine." He hesitated, then turned the ledger just enough for her to see the line. "Paid in full. S. Vane, Administrator's Office." Below, it was a notation Nora had not expected. 2 bolts, mourning cloth. Black. 1 child coffin. Pine. 1 adult coffin. Pine. Delivered to Creed's. Nora touched the page. 3 coffins? That is what it says. Martha's map only marks Clara. Then maybe Martha missed the boys. Or maybe the boys were never buried there. Hobb shut the book too hard. A person can make a grave out of any question if she digs long enough. Outside, the street had begun to watch her. Amos Creed stood in front of his shop fitting black gloves onto his hands. Though he had no funeral bell ringing. He tipped his hat when Nora passed. "Mrs. Bellamy," he called, gentle as a hymn. "I hope you found what you needed among Mr. Hobbs' old debts." Nora stopped. "You keep an interest in many people's errands. Only when grief leads them into embarrassment." Was Clara Whitcomb embarrassed too? For the first time, something cooled behind his eyes. It did not stay long. Clara was ill, poor, and alone. "I buried her for less than the work cost me. There are women in this town who remember that kindness. And her boys?" His mouth softened again. "The fever was not a courtroom, Mrs. Bellamy. It did not leave every answer arranged for clerks. That was the sort of sentence men liked because it sounded wise and hid the place where truth should stand." By noon, a different story began moving through town. Ada Marin had not died at all, someone whispered. She had run off with a cattle buyer from Abilene. There had been talk even then, people said. A woman with land and no husband invited rumors the way sugar invited ants. Maybe Amos had buried an empty coffin to protect her shame. Maybe Dr. Wren had signed because a living scandal could harm a town worse than a dead lie. The story was ugly, but it worked because it gave everyone permission to stop caring. If Ada had run, then Nora was not uncovering theft. She was dragging up a woman's disgrace. Nora almost believed it for the length of one tired afternoon. She sat at her sorting bench with Ada's wooden button, Clara's account copied on a scrap, and Martha's map spread beneath the window. If Ada had run away, the empty grave made sense. The quick transfer might have been punishment or convenience. A town did many cruel things to women who stepped outside its lines. But Clara's name sat on the same map, same week, same Undertaker, same neat handling of property and burial goods. Clara had no land worth much, only a rented room, a sewing machine with a cracked wheel, and 2 boys, whose names did not appear on Martha's fever row. Mabel climbed onto the bench with effort. Nora started to scold her, but the cat lowered her nose to the map and sniffed along the penciled names. She passed Ada, paused at Clara, then pressed her paw against a third mark Nora had barely noticed. Lucy Bell, spinster, room 4, Carter House. The note beside Lucy was not empty. It was a small cross. darker than the others, as if Martha had pressed the pencil too hard. Nora copied the name and went to the Carter house before she could talk herself out of it. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and furniture polish. Mrs. Carter would not let Nora pass the front hall, but she remembered Lucy Bell clearly, because Lucy had kept her rent in coin rolls wrapped with blue ribbon. "She died of fever too?" Nora asked. "So," Dr. Wren said. "Who claimed her things?" Mrs. Carter's expression tightened. "A cousin from East had papers." "What cousin?" "A man. Thin. Brown beard. He knew enough." "Enough what?" "Enough to sign." Nora left with a new fact and a worse fear. Ada had land. Clara had children. Lucy had coin rolls. Different women, different property, same season, same death paper, same men standing near the records. At dusk, Nora went to Dr. Elias Wren. His office sat behind the apothecary, where dried herbs hung from rafters and the air carried camphor, whiskey, and old regrets. Dr. Wren was thinner than Nora remembered, with yellowed fingers and spectacles that magnified the red in his eyes. He listened while she named Ada, Clara, and Lucy. With each name, his hand moved closer to the drawer of his desk. "I signed hundreds of papers that summer," he said. "People died faster than families could mourn. Did you see Ada Marin's body?" He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the drawer. "I saw a covered face." Whose hand lifted the sheet? His silence answered before his mouth did. Amos handled the dead. That was his duty. And Clara Whitcomb? Mrs. Bellamy. Fever does not ask permission to be disorderly. No men do. He looked at her then, and for one moment she saw fear not of sickness but of memory. "Leave this alone," he whispered. "If Ada ran, let her stay gone. If she died, let her stay buried. Either truth will cost more than you own." Nora stood. "It already has." When she returned to the wash shed, the door stood open. Mabel was gone. For 1 sick second, Nora thought Amos had taken her. Then she heard a faint scrape beneath the sorting bench. Mabel had not gone far. She had dragged something through the mud and left it beside the laundry pail, exactly where this had all begun. It was a strip of blue ribbon, stiff with age, tied around 3 tarnished coins. Nora knelt slowly. Lucy Bell's rent money had been wrapped in blue ribbon. On the inside of the ribbon, written in ink so faded it nearly vanished, was one name: Creed. Nora did not touch the coins until morning. She left them on the sorting bench, where Mabel had dropped them, wrapped in the blue ribbon that carried Amos Creed's name inside its faded fold. Through the night, she kept waking to look at them. 3 coins did not prove murder. 3 coins did not prove stolen inheritance, false coffins, or a doctor signing what he had not seen. They proved only that something once belonging to Lucy Bell had passed near Creed's hands and had somehow found its way back through a half-blind cat. Still, Nora knew money had a smell when it came from fear. These coins smelled of old cloth, cedar dust, and the closed drawer of a room no one had opened for years. Mabel slept under the stove ledge, her hurt paw tucked close. She had eaten almost nothing. At dawn, when Nora bent to check the bandage, the cat did not bite or pull away. That frightened Nora more than claws would have. "You are staying here," Nora said. Mabel opened her good eye, as if tired of hearing promises people never kept. Nora took the ribbon, the coins, Martha's map, and the copy she had made from Hobbs' ledger. She was halfway to the Carter house when Amos Creed stepped from the shade of his awning. He held his hat in both hands. His face had the careful softness men wore when they wanted witnesses to admire their mercy. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "I owe you an apology." That stopped her, more surely than a threat. "I spoke sharply yesterday. A man who works with grief sometimes forgets how it looks from outside his door." He glanced toward 2 women passing the mercantile, then lowered his voice just enough to seem kind. "You have been under strain. Your debt, your widowhood, that unfortunate animal stirring old places. If $27 would quiet the matter and protect your little shed, I could arrange it." Nora felt the street listening. "What matter?" His smile thinned. "The one that may harm people who have already suffered." "You mean the dead?" "I mean the living, who must carry their names." For a moment, Nora saw the shape of his bargain. He would save her shed, and she would become the sort of woman who took coins to let another woman stay buried wrong. I wash dirt, Mr. Creed. I do not marry it. She walked away before fear could make her polite. At the Carter house, Mrs. Carter refused to discuss Lucy Bell again until Nora laid the blue ribbon on the hall table. The landlady's face changed at once. She touched it with 2 fingers, then pulled her hand back as though it might burn. Lucy tied every coin roll with that ribbon, she said. Said blue made money less lonely. Where was room 4? Mrs. Carter looked toward the stairs. It is storage now. Let me see it. I could lose boarders over old talk. 3 women may have lost more than boarders. That did it. Shame opened what pity had not. Room 4 sat at the back of the 2nd floor, under a slanted ceiling where summer heat gathered and winter wind found the cracks. Dust lay over trunks, broken chairs, and a washstand with no bowl. Nora found nothing at first but mouse droppings and a calendar from 11 years ago. Then Mabel scratched at the door. Nora turned. The cat stood in the hallway, sides moving fast, mud on her whiskers. She must have followed from the shed by alleys and porch shadows, spending what little strength she had left. You wicked thing, Nora whispered. But her throat hurt when she said it. Mabel slipped into room 4 and went straight to the washstand. She did not leap. She could not. Nora lifted her onto the cracked top. The cat nosed the wall behind it, where the wallpaper had bubbled in a long vertical seam. When Nora pressed the bubble, a strip of paper gave way and revealed a narrow gap between boards. Inside was a flat parcel wrapped in dress muslin and tied with black thread. Mrs. Carter crossed herself, though she had never been a Catholic. Nora untied the parcel on the bed frame. The first item was a small sewing pattern book, its brown cover rubbed pale at the corners. Inside were sketches of collars, cuffs, bodices, sleeve measurements, and coded marks in Ada Marin's hand. Nora knew the work before she read the name. Ada had drawn with the same discipline she used to stitch. Nothing wasted, every line meant to hold. Between the pages lay lists that were not sewing lists. Clara Whitcomb, Brown Morning, 3 coffins billed, only 1 plot marked. Lucy Bell, room account, settled by unknown cousin, coin rolls removed. Ada Marin Willow Run deed under review. Water right contested, petition unfinished. There were more names. Rebecca Vale, June Haskell, Mary Price. Women Nora had washed for, spoken to, or passed at the pump without knowing she was passing the edge of their ruin. Besides several names, Ada had written initials A, C, S, V, E, W. Amos Creed, Silas Vane, Elias Wren. Nora sat on the edge of the bed frame. Her hands shook so badly the pages fluttered. Mrs. Carter whispered, Ada left that? No, Nora said after a moment. Ada hid it. At the back of the book was an envelope addressed but never mailed. Probate Auditor Helen Shaw, Bracken County Review Office. The seal had been pressed and broken, as if Ada had closed it, opened it again, and run out of time. Inside was a letter in Ada's narrow hand. Nora meant only to scan it for proof. Instead, the first line took the breath from her. If this reaches you, it means I have failed to make them listen while I am living. The letter described a pattern of fast burials, altered estate entries, missing witnesses, and women whose property passed through hands too clean to be honest. Ada had not written like a frightened woman. She had written like a seamstress taking apart a garment to show where it had been cut wrong. Then, near the end, the letter changed. The land at Willow Run was not meant for me alone, Ada wrote. If I can keep the deed and water right clear, I intend to place it in trust for a washhouse and workroom for widows, abandoned wives, and women whose labor is used until it becomes invisible. Nora Bellamy sees what others rinse away. If she can be persuaded to help with accounts, no man in Bracken Hollow will pass a stained lie through her hands unnoticed. Nora read the line twice, then a third time, slower. She had thought Ada Marin remembered her as the woman who scrubbed cuffs, pressed seams, and stood near back doors waiting for payment. She had never known Ada had looked at her and seen anything useful beyond a pair of cracked hands. Mabel, exhausted from her climb, lowered herself onto the pattern book, and rested her chin near Ada's letter, as if guarding it from the room. Below the stairs, the front bell rang. Mrs. Carter stepped into the hall and came back pale. "Silas Vane is downstairs, with Deputy Pike." Nora folded the letter, but not quickly enough to hide the tremor in her fingers. The proof had finally become large enough to ruin men. That meant it had become large enough for men to call stolen. She slid Ada's book under Thomas's coat, gathered Mabel against her chest, and looked toward the back window. It opened onto a narrow roof above the kitchen porch. Mrs. Carter stared at her. "You cannot climb out with that cat." Nora held Ada's letter against her ribs. "Then I suppose I'll fall with her." Nora did not fall from the roof. She came close enough to feel the kitchen gutter tear under her boot and hear Mrs. Carter gasp behind her. Mabel pressed against her ribs inside Thomas's coat, too tired to fight, too frightened to make a sound. Below, Silas Vane's voice moved through the boarding-house parlor with the dry patience of a man who knew walls listened better than people. "Mrs. Bellamy has taken materials belonging to an estate record," he said. "No harm will come if she returns them." Nora eased one knee onto the porch roof, slid down the shingles, and dropped into the mud behind the kitchen. Pain shot up her ankle, but she stayed standing. From the second-floor window, Mrs. Carter stared down with one hand over her mouth. Nora put a finger to her lips and limped into the alley. She made it 3 blocks before Owen Pike found her. He stepped from the shadow behind the livery with rain dripping from his hat brim. His hand rested near his holster, not on it. That small mercy did not make him safe. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, breathing hard. "Silas says you stole probate documents. Silas says many things in rooms he controls. Did you take something from the Carter house?" Nora held Mabel closer, the pattern book pressed flat against her stomach under the coat. Ada's letter seemed to burn through the cloth. "I found what Ada hid before someone made a coffin lie for her." Owen looked toward the street, where voices were rising near the boarding house. "If you have proof, bring it in proper. Proper is where proof disappears." He flinched as if she had struck him. For a moment, he was not a deputy. He was a young man standing between the town that fed him and a truth that might starve him. "They will search your shed by morning," he said quietly. "Silas is calling it stolen estate property. Amos says the book, if there is one, belongs to the Marin estate. The estate they emptied. I am telling you what they will say." "Why?" Owen swallowed. "Because I remember fever summer enough to know the records should not look that clean." Then he stepped aside. Nora did not thank him. Gratitude was a dangerous thing to leave in the open. She moved through the back lanes to the old cemetery, where Martha Boone kept tools in a leaning shed that smelled of dirt, rope, and cedar stakes. Martha listened while Nora showed her Ada's book, the letter, the initials, and the blue ribbon tied around Lucy Bell's coins. The old woman's face hardened with each page, but when Nora asked her to speak publicly, Martha shook her head before the question was finished. "My niece copies marriage licenses in that courthouse," Martha said. "Silas can ruin her with one sentence. Then he owns your silence too." Martha's eyes flashed. "Do not talk to me like fear is laziness. I have buried women whose husbands spent their coffin money on drink. I have marked babies with no names. I kept that map because someday a door might open, but I cannot be the first one through it." Nora wanted to argue. Instead, she looked at Mabel, curled on a sack of grave lime with her bad paw tucked under her chest. Every creature in that shed was afraid, and fear did not make any of them false. "Hide the book for one night," Nora said. "If they search my shed, let them find laundry." Martha took the pattern book as if it were hotter than stove iron. One night, by dawn, Bracken Hollow had become a town of closed doors. The wash shed had been searched before Nora reached it. Nothing was broken. That was Amos's kind of cruelty. The folded sheets were moved, the floorboards lifted, the blue cup of pennies set neatly on the sorting bench. Even her private poverty had been arranged for her to see. A note lay beside the pennies in Silas Vane's hand. "Unauthorized possession of estate material may result in seizure of property pending inquiry." Nora read it twice, then burned it in the stove. Smoke curled black around the kettle. Mabel sniffed the disturbed floor, limped to the back corner, and began scratching at the boards under Thomas's old bootjack. Nora knelt beside her. There is nothing there. The cat scratched again, weakly but with purpose. Nora lifted the bootjack. Under it, caught in a crack between boards, was a sliver of paper no wider than a finger. She almost missed the writing because water had blurred the ink. It was not old. It had fallen from whoever searched the shed. Received from A. C. For special night removal. $3. The signature below was only a smear, but the printed header at the top remained clear. Wren Medical Office. Nora folded the slip into her sleeve and went straight to Dr. Elias Wren. He did not invite her in. He stood in his office doorway with a shawl around his shoulders, though the morning was warm. Behind him, bottles caught the light in pale green rose. "You should not come here," he said. "Someone paid your office for a night removal." His eyes moved to the folded slip before she took it out. That was answer enough. Nora showed it to him. Was Ada Marin removed at night? He closed his eyes. "I do not remember every transport." "Then remember one." His face folded inward. "Amos came after midnight during fever week. Said he had 3 bodies waiting and no time for niceties. He brought papers already written. I signed some after seeing faces, some after seeing covered forms, once or twice after seeing nothing at all, because the wagons were lined outside and people were dying in hallways." "Did he pay you?" "No." The denial came too fast. Then he sat down heavily. "He paid the office account. Supplies. Laudanum. Disinfectant. I told myself it was for the sick. And Silas." Silas made the entries match what Amos brought him. "Say that in front of people." Wren looked up, frightened and angry. "People? Mrs. Bellamy, if I say that, every paper I signed that summer becomes suspect. Every family will wonder whether I buried their dead or their proof. I am old. I have little left but my name." Nora thought of Ada's letter. She thought of Clara's boys, Lucy's coin rolls, the empty word on Martha's map. Some women lost more than a name. He turned away from her. She left without his testimony. At the wash shed, Amos Creed was waiting. He stood by the tubs with his hat in hand, looking around the little room as if already measuring it for another use. "A hard morning," he said. "Searches make a place feel undignified. You would know." A shadow crossed his face and passed. "There is still time to end this gently. Give back whatever Ada left. I will speak to Silas about the debt. I may even persuade him to withdraw the seizure notice." Nora kept her hands still. "You are offering kindness again. I am offering mercy." "No. Mercy costs the giver something." For the first time, Amos stepped close enough that she smelled cedar shavings on his coat. His voice stayed low. "Mrs. Bellamy, a woman can be buried in more ways than one. Reputation is a grave with no marker." Mabel came out from under the stove with a sound like tearing cloth. She was too weak for a proper hiss, but she put herself between Amos and Nora, back arched, wounded paw trembling. Amos looked down at her with quiet disgust. Graveyard animals should be put down before they spread sickness. Nora lifted the iron poker from beside the stove. "Touch her, and I will give this town a fresh reason to talk." Amos smiled, because now she looked exactly as he wanted. Poor, wild, dangerous, holding iron in her own defense. He backed out through the door, leaving the threat behind him like a scent. That evening, Owen came after dark and did not step inside. He handed Nora a folded notice through the doorway. "Tomorrow at noon, Silas is opening the probate room for Auditor Helen Shaw's preliminary review. Public objections may be entered before the room is sealed." Nora gripped the paper. "Why tell me?" "Because after noon, anything not entered may be called rumor." He looked at Mabel, then at the poker still near Nora's hand. "And because Mr. Creed asked where a man might buy strychnine for rats." After Owen left, Nora sat beside Mabel until the lamp burned low. The cat's breathing was shallow. Her good eye stayed open, fixed on the road toward the courthouse. Nora understood then that tomorrow would not wait for courage to feel ready. By morning, Nora had stopped thinking of the courthouse as a building. It was a box. Men like Silas Vane kept the keys, men like Amos Creed kept the stories, and women like Clara Whitcomb, Lucy Bell, and Ada Marin were folded inside until their names lay flat enough to file. At noon, that box would open for Auditor Helen Shaw, and if Nora did not place truth inside it before Silas sealed the room, every scrap she had found could be called rumor, theft, or madness by supper. Mabel lay on the table wrapped in Nora's shawl. Her breathing had steadied but not strengthened. When Nora set a saucer of milk near her, the old cat only turned her head toward the door. "No," Nora said. "You have carried enough." Mabel's good eye stayed fixed on the road. Nora left her with the stove warm and the window cracked for air. Then she took the receipt from Wren's office, Lucy's ribbon, Martha's old map, and Ada's unfinished letter copied in her own hand. The original pattern book was still with Martha Boone, and without it, Nora had a story with missing bones. She crossed to the cemetery first. Martha was already awake, standing among the fever plots with Ada's book wrapped in oilcloth. Her knife hung at her belt. She looked older than the night before, as if the names inside the book had leaned against her spine. "I read it," Martha said before Nora could ask. "Not all. Enough. Then you know. I knew pieces. Pieces are easier to carry." Nora held out her hands. "I need the book." Martha did not give it over. "Silas will say you stole it. Amos will say you are disturbing the dead. Dr. Wren will say memory is uncertain. Owen will stand where his badge tells him to stand. And when the room turns against you, people will watch your face to decide whether truth looks respectable enough. Then stand with me." Martha gave a dry laugh. "I told you I cannot be first through the door." "No," Nora said. "You only have to be second." That touched the old woman more than pleading would have. She looked toward the courthouse roof, then down at the fever row. At last, she pushed the oilcloth bundle into Nora's arms. "If I speak, my niece may lose her place. If you do not, Ada loses hers forever." Martha closed her eyes once, then opened them hard. "At noon, I will bring the original map. Not before. If I come sooner, fear will have too much time to find me." A frightened promise was still more than silence. Her second stop was Hobbs Mercantile. He tried to be busy with coffee beans, but he had set Clara Whitcomb's account book on the counter already. "I will not accuse a man in public," he said. "I am not asking you to accuse. I am asking you to read what you wrote. My writing is not proof. It proves Clara was billed for 3 coffins and 1 marked grave." Hobb rubbed both hands over his apron. "Her boys were good boys. One swept my step for peppermint sticks. If they were buried proper, there ought to be names." "Then say that." He looked toward Creed's shop across the street. Amos stood in his doorway, watching without seeming to watch. "At noon," Hobbs said quietly. "If others speak first." Nora almost smiled. Bravery in Bracken Hollow was becoming a line of people waiting not to be alone. Mrs. Carter surprised her most. She met Nora behind the boarding house with a folded scrap of wallpaper from room 4 and a tarnished key tied to blue ribbon. "Lucy hid things in that wall because she said locks taught thieves where to look," Mrs. Carter said. "I found the key under the bed slat after you left. It opens her old trunk. The trunk is in Creed's storage shed. He collected her belongings after the cousin came." "What cousin?" Mrs. Carter looked ashamed. "I never saw his face in daylight. Brown beard. Thin. He signed with his left hand. Silas Vane was left-handed." Nora put the key in her pocket and felt the case change again. Lucy's room, Clara's bill, Ada's book, Wren's receipt, Martha's map, each answered a question and raised a worse one. If there was a cousin, he had been made of ink and county authority. If Lucy's trunk still sat in Creed's shed, it might hold the original coin rolls or nothing at all. Either way, noon was coming too fast. At Dr. Wren's office, the blinds were drawn. Nora knocked until he opened the door a hand's width. "I will not speak," he said. "You have not heard what I ask. I know what you ask. You ask an old man to empty the only name he has left into the street. I ask you to tell whether Amos brought bodies or covered shapes." Wren's mouth trembled. "I wrote what I was told because people were dying and I was tired. At first, later, I knew enough to stop and lacked the courage. Then bring that much. He shook his head. Nora took Ada's copied letter from her pocket and read the line about women whose labor became invisible, and the line about Nora seeing what others rinsed away. Ren listened with his hand braced against the doorframe. When she finished, he whispered, "Ada came to me once." Nora went still. She asked whether a death paper could be challenged after burial. I told her no decent town would open such grief without cause. She said, cause was often buried by men who called themselves decent. He swallowed. 3 nights later, Amos brought word she was gone. Say that at noon. He looked past her to the street. I will come. I do not know if I will speak. It was not enough. But most doors opened first by a crack. Near 11, Nora returned to the wash shed. The room smelled wrong before she crossed the threshold. Sweet, bitter, sharp beneath the lie. Mabel was no longer on the table. Nora found her on the floor beside the stove, dragging herself away from a saucer she had overturned. White powder clung to the milk. For a moment, the world narrowed to the cat's shallow breathing. Nora dropped to her knees and swept the saucer away. Mabel's tongue had barely touched the milk. Stubbornness or suspicion had saved her more than Nora had. Still, the cat shook as Nora washed her mouth with wet cloth and held her close. Outside, Amos's brindlehound barked once from the lane, then was called off. Nora wrapped Mabel in the shawl and tucked Ada's book beneath her arm. She had meant to leave the cat safe. There was no safe place left. At noon, the courthouse steps were crowded. Silas stood by the door with a stack of folders. Amos stood beside him, polished and calm. Owen waited below the steps, eyes moving from Nora to the bundle in her arms. Behind Nora came Mrs. Carter with Lucy's key, Hob with his ledger, and Martha Boone carrying the old cemetery map flat against her chest. Dr. Wren appeared last, pale under his hat. Amos carried his leather valise under one arm, the same dark case Nora had seen him take twice from the storage shed behind his shop. For a moment, a narrow piece of blue ribbon showed from the side pocket before he tucked it away. The room did not fall silent when Nora entered. It divided. Silas lifted his voice. This proceeding concerns probate order, not public theater. Nora stepped forward with Mabel against her heart and Ada's pattern book in her hand. Then let the order start with the women you buried on paper. Across the room, Auditor Helen Shaw looked up from the review table. Name them, she said. Nora stood in the probate room with Mabel against her chest and every eye in Bracken Hollow, measuring whether a washerwoman was allowed to sound like truth. Auditor Helen Shaw sat at the long review table in a dark traveling dress. Her gray hair pinned tight. Before her lay Silas Vane's neat folders, Amos Creed's burial register, and a brass seal heavy enough to make paper feel like law. She looked from Nora to the bundle in her arms. Name them, she said again. Nora opened Ada Marin's pattern book. Ada Marin, she began. Recorded dead of fever, September 9th, 12 years ago. Buried by Amos Creed, certified by Dr. Elias Wren. Property moved through probate 2 days later. She turned a page. Clara Whitcomb, widow. Billed for 3 coffins, marked on the old cemetery map with 1 grave. Lucy Bell, boarder at Carter House. Coins removed by a cousin Mrs. Carter never saw in daylight. Silas rose before she could say more. Auditor Shaw, this woman is in unauthorized possession of private estate material. That book has not been entered, authenticated, or legally surrendered. It was hidden in Lucy Bell's room, Nora said, which makes it stolen twice over. A murmur moved through the room. Amos lowered his eyes with grave patience. No one doubts Mrs. Bellamy has suffered strain, but grief, poverty, and a fondness for a diseased animal do not create evidence. Mabel stirred under the shawl. Her good eye opened. Helen Shaw held up one hand. Mr. Vane, sit. Mrs. Bellamy, continue. But understand this room does not reward drama. No, ma'am, Nora said. It seems to reward clean handwriting. A few people shifted. Silas's jaw tightened. She laid out Martha's old map beside the official fever plat. Martha Boone stood near the rear wall, both hands locked around her knife handle though the blade stayed sheathed. Nora pointed to Ada's original plot, then to the marker position copied later in Silas's file. Ada's marker moved 6 feet east. Clara's boys were billed but not marked. Lucy had no family in Bracken Hollow, yet someone signed as kin and took her trunk to Creed's storage shed. Silas placed a paper on the table. The cousin exists. Filed statement. Caleb Bell, relation by marriage, left-handed signature due to injury, properly witnessed. Mrs. Carter looked confused. I never said his first name. Silas smiled. You were a landlady, not a clerk. Helen Shaw examined the statement. Witnessed by A. Creed. Amos bowed his head slightly. The man was in distress. I assisted. Nora felt the room tilt. A paperman had appeared where a living witness should have stood. The crowd wanted the comfort of it. A cousin made Lucy ordinary. A paper made Silas safe. Then Hobbs stepped forward with his account book held to his chest. Clara Whitcomb paid for 3 coffins through the administrator's office. Only 1 grave was marked. I wrote the bill. I did not ask enough questions. Silas turned on him. A merchant's invoice does not prove burial fraud. No, Hobbs said, voice thin but steady. It proves there should be 2 more names. Martha Boone moved next. She set her pencil map on the table and kept 1 finger on the word empty. I moved no markers. Amos told me Ada's first grave flooded. It had not rained in 6 days. Clara's row was copied wrong after Silas came with the new plat. I kept the old one because I am a coward, not a liar. The room quieted in a different way. Helen Shaw turned to Dr. Wren. The old doctor stood by the door, pale enough to look half-buried himself. Doctor, did you personally view Ada Marin's body before signing her death paper? Wren's mouth opened. Nothing came. Amos looked at him with soft sorrow. Elias, fever summer damaged us all. Do not let a woman's confusion make you condemn your own service. Wren gripped the back of a chair. I saw a covered form. Whose hand lifted the sheet? Helen asked. No one's. His voice cracked. Amos said there was no time. He brought papers. I signed. More than once, I signed after covered forms. Once, perhaps more, after seeing nothing. The room broke open with whispers. Silas struck the table with his palm. Memory after 12 years is not proof. Neither is a cat, a washerwoman's speculation, or an old woman's pencil marks. At the word cat, Mabel moved. She pushed out of Nora's shawl and dropped badly to the floor. Nora reached for her, but Mabel limped under the review table, past Helen Shaw's boots, and straight toward Amos Creed's leather valise. The Undertaker stepped back too quickly. Mabel hooked her good claws into the side pocket and pulled until a small brass key fell out, tied with a shred of blue ribbon. Mrs. Carter gasped. That is Lucy's ribbon. Amos's face changed then. Not much. Only enough for every person who had trusted him to feel the change inside themselves. That is my storage key, he said. It matches the key Mrs. Carter found, Nora said. Lucy's trunk is in your shed. Helen Shaw looked to Owen. Deputy, bring it here. Silas objected. Amos objected more gently. Helen listened to neither. Owen left at a run and came back with 2 men carrying a small cedar trunk. Mrs. Carter's key opened it. Inside were coin rolls tied with blue ribbon, 3 letters from Ada Marin to Lucy Bell, and a folded draft petition listing 6 women whose property had passed through the same hands after fever deaths. At the bottom lay a burial receipt book smaller than the official register. Amos reached for it. Mabel rose with a sound like torn cloth and sank her teeth into his cuff. He shouted and struck down with his free hand. Nora caught Mabel before the blow landed, but the room had seen enough. The polished Undertaker, his hand raised against the half-dead creature that had found what men hid. Owen seized Amos's wrist. For once, the badge did not look borrowed. Helen Shaw opened the small receipt book. Night removal, special handling, no viewing, paid through administrator. She turned pages. A, C, S, V, E, W, repeated across multiple entries. This room is sealed. All transfers connected to these estates are frozen pending county inquiry. Deputy, secure Mr. Creed's shop Mr. Vane's files, and Dr. Wren's office ledgers. Silas sat as if his bones had been cut. Amos did not. He looked at Nora with a courtesy so cold it barely belonged to a human face. "You have mistaken disturbance for justice." Nora held Mabel closer. "No, I mistook silence for peace. That was my error." By sunset, Bracken Hollow knew the names. Ada Marin had not run away in shame. Clara Whitcomb's boys had not vanished from memory by accident. Lucy Bell's cousin had been ink, beard, and convenience. Dr. Wren was not spared, but his confession opened the room. Silas Vane's ledgers were locked under Helen Shaw's seal. Amos Creed's coffin shop was shuttered for the first time since Fever Summer. Public justice came with paper, signatures, and the ugly patience of law. It did not bring Ada back. It did not tell Nora where every missing body lay, but it stopped the auction of her wash shed, froze Willow Run, and gave the dead women their names in the record before any man could fold them flat again. 3 evenings later, Nora carried Mabel to the narrow graveyard behind the coffin shop. Owen had placed guards there, but he let her through. Ada's marker still leaned in the wrong place. The false coffin below it had been opened properly now, its stones tagged as evidence, its scraps dried and labeled. Nora set one clean square of white linen on the ground, not as burial cloth, but as a promise that something would be made clean in the open. Mabel lay against her knee, lighter than grief ought to be. Her paw was bandaged, her breath shallow, but her good eye followed the settling light. "I did not know she saw me," Nora whispered. The cat blinked slowly. At the wash shed, Ada's letter waited on the sorting bench beside the blue cup of pennies. Helen Shaw had said the trust would take months, maybe years, and that justice moved slower than water in drought. Nora understood. She had spent her life soaking stains before trying to lift them. She opened the door. Mabel limped inside first, crossed to the same rusted laundry pail where she had once dropped pieces of the dead, and curled beside it as if her work had finally found a place to rest. Nora hung Ada's letter above the sorting bench, where white linen could not lie in shadow. Then she lit the stove, washed her hands, and began again.